Joining us now is Poppy Harlow, anchor of CNN This Morning, to guide a conversation with Lael Brainard, director of the U.S. Economic Council.
Hi, everyone having a good time? I made it just in time. My Amtrak got here at 11:51, so I'm thrilled to be with all of you and thrilled to sit down with you, Lael. Thank you so much for the time. Before we get started, I think, because you haven't done a ton of interviews in this new position, and I appreciate you doing this with us, but as I was reading about her, I found something that I thought would be interesting to everyone, and that is what you did far before this job. This was your 2014 commencement address to Claremont McKenna. And you told graduates to take risks, to travel, to live richly. And you said, after you graduated, I didn't acquire a stick of furniture. I shared living spaces with dubious characters in shabby neighborhoods. I was pretty handy with a can opener. I slept in a rented car more than I'd like to admit. And I roamed the country and the globe incessantly and acquired a treasure trove of experiences that continue to inform me today. So that is your unique perspective that you come into this job with. How has it made you think about your responsibility and what really is an extraordinary moment for average Americans, right, that are the ones struggling the most, whether we're talking about inflation, whether we're talking about what this banking crisis is going to really mean?
Yeah, so I think what it does is I always think about who are we making policy for? And for me, I always try to remember the people that I meet when I travel around the country, and we're making policy for hardworking Americans. And so when we make decisions, and there are no easy decisions in these jobs, the president is always focused on middle-class, hardworking Americans and how is this going to bring down costs for them? How's it going to create breathing room? How's it going to create good jobs in their neighborhoods? And that's the perspective, I think, that informs all of our policies.
You have been central in the last, say, month and a half since the failure of SVB and Signature Bank in the room, not only with the president and all of those leading the economic team at the White House, but with the top bankers. Spent time recently with Jamie Dimon, for example. I just sat down with him last week in Atlanta, and I asked him a question I'll ask you the same, which is America's banking system writ large safe and secure for all those folks you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think the banking system is very sound. It's stable. The core of the banking system has a great deal of capital that was put in place in the wake of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. It served us well. There were some banks who were not managing their risks effectively. They failed, and the president took strong actions along with the Secretary of the Treasury and the banking regulators. Those actions reassured Americans their deposits are safe, the banking system is sound, but it was also important to the president that the executives at those failed banks be held accountable, and very important that taxpayer money not be at risk.
I think one of the questions now is many Americans feel like all of their deposits to an unlimited ceiling are going to be insured because that was what was guaranteed to these two banks, and how can you not do it for the rest if it were to come to that?
So we took very targeted actions in the case of two banks that were poorly managed and took unacceptable risks and failed. Those were targeted actions. They were strong actions, but they were targeted on very specific risks.
But does that mean, should we see another bank failure in the next year, it would not be the case that all depositors are protected at every level?
Yeah, so I think we've seen a playbook. It works very well, but it is relevant for banks that fail. I think more broadly, there's questions that may be addressed over a longer period of time, where I think the FDIC has taken it upon itself to do a study and think about more broadly, should we think differently about deposit insurance, and that's on a slower track.
So that the question is, should there be a ceiling at all, or should the ceiling be raised? Do you believe that bigger banks, the biggest of the banks that are essentially too big to fail, that it should be more progressive in terms of they should contribute more to that fund?
Well, we've certainly said that in terms of making up any losses to the deposit insurance fund, which is done through bank fees, not through taxpayers, that community banks should certainly be exempted, that they really didn't contribute to this instability, and that it would be a disproportionate burden for them.
But what about the big guys?
So I think with regard to exactly how those fees are tailored to different size classes of banks, that's something that the FDIC will decide. But what was really important is that community banks not have additional burdens.
Do you think there will be more bank failures this year?
So I think what is important is that banks have now seen, bank executives have seen some of the stresses that the two failed banks were under, and they're shoring up their balance sheets, and they are convincing depositors and investors alike that they have a good strategy and they are risk managing effectively. If a bank is not effective in doing that, then I think you might still see some investors really pushing harder. So we'll see in the months ahead. No, I think this is very much an individual set of banks that took some unusual risks. And so I think investors are just very attuned to those risks, and bank management know they need to show that they have viable business models.
Just to put a button on that, it sounds like you're saying it is possible there could be more bank failures this year, not probable. Is that a fair assessment?
So I think, generally speaking, I can't speak to the supervision of individual banks because I'm not in the supervision business. But I can say that generally speaking, we've seen deposit outflows stabilize. All of the indicators that one would look at have really improved over the last few weeks. So there's good reasons to think that that situation has stabilized.
And we'll see earnings pretty soon as well.
Yes.
One of the things that I think it's important that everyone knows about you and your position in your almost decade, on the Fed board, is that when Senate Bill 2155 was passed, which rolled back some of the regulations for banks with under $250 billion in assets, it rolled back some of Dodd-Frank. You wrote about it, and I went back this week and I read what you wrote, and I read your warning sign to many of your colleagues who really supported this, and you said, today's actions go beyond what's required by law. They weaken the safeguards at the core of the system before they have been tested through a full cycle. I am concerned that the rules we're voting on today go beyond the requirements of S2155 and weaken core safeguards against the vulnerabilities that cause so much damage in the crisis. Yes, hindsight is a beautiful thing, but you saw something then that a lot of people didn't. How can we use that now?
So I think when those strong safeguards were put in place, it materially strengthened the banking system. And weakening those safeguards, that's liquidity management, capital, strong capital buffers to absorb losses, strong living wills for when a bank fails. All of those things were removed or weakened for banks in the size class 100 to 250 billion, where those two banks failed. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, it is a little bit of a lesson. What was the benefit as opposed to the cost? And the cost is now apparent, that we did see two failures that led to ripples throughout the system.
When you're talking about that cost so specifically, do you really believe if that bill hadn't passed and Dodd-Frank had remained the same for all of those banks, even the smaller, more regional ones, that SVB and Signature would have fallen in that category, they wouldn't have failed? A lot of people, including Jamie Dimon and others who you met with, say, no, this regulation wouldn't have stopped that.
So the president worked with the bank regulators and the Department of Treasury and put out a list of reforms that don't actually require changing the law,
right,
but just call on the regulators to put back in place the strong safeguards. So do I think liquidity stress tests would have alerted the supervisors to the fact that uninsured deposits were a huge percentage of deposits, really unusual in the case of Silicon Valley? Yes, I do.
I believe SVB wasn't going to face another one of those till June of 24.
So they hadn't undergone, they didn't have liquidity requirements, they didn't have capital stress tests, they hadn't had a single one. Do I think that a capital stress test that stressed for interest rate increases could have made a material difference? I do, and those are the reforms that the president has recommended.
One of the things that was so striking in watching SVB and the collapse play out is that we learned from some really good reporters that 6 times, no less than 6 times, had regulators told SVB, look, you have what you guys call matters requiring attention, and the bank didn't fix those vulnerabilities. And it turns out that in 2021, there was a Fed rule issued that is just guidance, that it doesn't have to be enforced. And so my question to you, Lael, is, should the public know when a bank ignores regulators 6 times in a row? How do you weigh the benefit of the public knowing and the risk of sparking a run on the bank if you make that public?
So I think it's one of the issues that the Federal Reserve really needs to take seriously. You're exactly right that what happened was not just that rules were weakened, but that there was a change in supervision to much lighter touch supervision. With messaging that fewer issues should be escalated, that examiners should not be as intrusive for this size class of banks. Of course, in retrospect, we know that that was a mistake.
Did you push against that when you were there?
So that was a portfolio that belonged to a colleague, and so it really was not my place. But do I think that supervision clearly needs to be very strong? We just learned that, and that's part of the recommendations the president put forward.
So let's talk a little bit about inflation. Just today, some good news on inflation. CPI came in the lowest level since 2021, so that's good, the March number. Do you think the Fed has been, at this point, has a nearly impossible task, or can more be done on inflation while managing this banking issue through policy?
So I think we are seeing inflation coming down. It's come down by about 45% since the peak, but we still have more work to do. And as you said, that CPI print today is the lowest annualized print we've seen since May of 2021. In terms of categories, we're starting to see consistent decreases in areas like used cars and electronics, things that matter to American families. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think what we're going to see in the months ahead is housing costs are going to start really coming down because we've seen new rentals coming down. So the trajectory here is a good one on inflation. In terms of where the economy is headed more broadly, we are seeing moderation. We are seeing a transition to steady, stable growth. We saw a really nice jobs report, which had both continued jobs gains, but also increased participation by prime-age Americans and a moderation in wage increases. All of that suggests the economy is actually on a good trajectory for inflation to come down while growth continues at a moderate path.
Whose job is it to get inflation down? The Fed, Congress, the White House?
Yeah, so...
Because I know I live in New York City, but my eggs were almost $8 at the market across the street in Brooklyn the other day.
I'm happy to say...
And they weren't the fancy kind.
I'm happy to say I checked, and egg prices are actually down.
Good.
And I purchased them a lot cheaper this week than I did
They're
even 2 weeks ago.
$4.49 at Trader Joe's. Can you tell that I do my
shopping
for my family?
But
it's still a lot.
So it's really a combination of things. Obviously, the monetary policy tools sit with the Federal Reserve, but we have important work that we're doing on the supply side of the economy. So for instance, the president introduced really important policy to bring insulin prices down to $35 a month for seniors, and now we're seeing that more companies are making that $35 a month pledge for all Americans. There are gas prices is something that the president worked really hard on, and those gas prices at the pump down $1.40 relative to the peak.
But OPEC Plus's movements are really frustrating those efforts.
So I would say that obviously the announcements are, we think, ill-advised, but generally speaking, prices at the pump are still down by $1.40 since the peak. And I think the president's focus is on those areas where we can make a material difference, like drug prices in the budget, that will continue to push to give Americans more breathing room.
Are you in the camp with those who have said in recent weeks that they believe that a recession in the U.S. is now slightly more likely because of the banking crisis in terms of credit tightening, lending, reining in? What do you think?
So I think that banks are showing some signs of pulling back a little bit on credit. That actually could do some of the Federal Reserve's work for them. But in terms of what I see in the economy overall, you know, it's a remarkably resilient economy. If you think about it, the American economy has sustained two historic shocks over the last 2 years, a global pandemic and a massive global commodity price shock associated with Russia's war. Despite that, as you have seen with the jobs report, 3.5% unemployment, participation now by prime age Americans higher than pre-pandemic, and inflation coming down across a broad set of categories. So to me, that suggests resilience. And the other piece that I think is just beginning to really work its way through the economy is a set of 3 historic bills that are going to lead to a reindustrialization and transformation of the US economy into the future.
Do you, to put a button on it and clarity for the American people, do you believe that this banking crisis has made a recession in the US more likely than if it hadn't happened?
I think that what we're seeing in the data is actually continued resilience.
Is that no?
I would say that we're seeing good signs across the board, even with banks doing what they need to do in terms of shoring up their balance sheets.
Okay. Let me get back to just a question I asked before, just so I understand what your position is in terms of banks that ignore regulators' guidance, which it should be mandated, but it's not right now. And so should the public be made aware when a bank, for example, 6 times ignores what regulators tell it, or do you risk a run on the bank? What's worse?
So my sense is that the bank regulators have to calibrate in a consistent way what guidance they make public or the banks need to make public and what guidance is not made public. So there's a escalation. That's for the Federal Reserve to decide, but I do think it's good practice for the public to be aware.
The public should know at some point, you're saying?
The public should generally know how well a bank is risk managing. That's why liquidity requirements that were removed, bank capital requirements, and stress tests that did not apply to these banks, those things should help the public test and sort of continue to investigate the resilience of their banks.
Right, because you can understand why an investor, a sophisticated investor, should know what's going on in a bank in terms of hedging inflation risk, but a depositor shouldn't have to be digging for that, right? They should at some point be given a heads up.
And that is what stress tests, liquidity requirements, capital requirements, all of those things, that's what they are intended to do.
Let's talk about the debt ceiling. Are we going to default?
So look, I think this is pretty straightforward. Year after year, Congress raises or suspends the debt limit. It's just a normal part of their responsibilities. That needs to happen. That is very clear. There is nothing good that can come from brinksmanship over the debt limit. It's also important, and this also happens every year, that the administration, Senate, House sit down and work through a budget. And so my hope is that those 2 things both happen.
But we all hope, but I'm just slightly concerned about how close we're getting here to the brink. And I mean, you talk to the leaders on Wall Street all the time, and what they're telling me is, even if we don't cross the brink, remember what happened about a decade ago? The markets feel it, we feel the pain before it happens, and it weakens America in the eyes of the world.
Yeah, so I think the president has been clear on this. Congress needs to find a way to lift the debt limit, and the consequences of not doing so, would be very, very dire. But it's doable. It's been done in every previous instance. And of course, we've put a budget on the table. We're very transparent about our spending, about areas of cuts, about the fiscal trajectory, fiscal responsibility, and about revenues. And we're ready to have a conversation about the budget.
You're ready to have a conversation with the budget, and I think we all understand that negotiations about future spending with Republicans in the White House are not about paying bills that we already agreed to, which is the debt ceiling. But It has been the position of the White House that it won't negotiate. And I wonder if the position of the White House will remain a hard no on negotiating on anything but a clean debt ceiling bill, even if the cost is default.
No, I think the White House, the president, is really looking forward to having a negotiation over the budget. The difficulty, of course, is you need to have a budget come forward from the House in order to have that conversation or to even start that conversation. So the best we can do is put our own budget out, which we've done, to get a sense of where we think the priority areas are for spending, for revenues, the trajectory on fiscal responsibility, but we can't have a discussion about that unless we also have a proposal on the other side.
Can you give us a sense of where you're willing to agree to cuts that Republicans want?
So it's very hard to do that because I don't know what that proposal looks like. Look, we've had 2 or 3 different proposals floating around. None of them have the kind of specificity that would be normal in a budget discussion. And so I think it's very hard to say that we have something that we know is going to be a proposal, but we look forward to that.
Joe Manchin, a Democratic senator, wrote in the recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, recent actions make clear to me that the Biden administration is determined to pursue an ideological agenda rather than confront the clear and present danger the debts and deficits pose to our nation. You don't share his view or no, the risk he sees?
No, I mean, we put a budget on the table that has deficit reduction over the 10-year horizon. We've seen massive reductions in deficits over the last 2 years. I think the president has a strong record on fiscal responsibility, and we have a set of tax proposals that would raise revenues. And again, you know, it is a negotiated discussion over the budget, and so we'd love to start that conversation with a proposal on the other side.
You do not believe we'll hit the point of default?
So I think it's very clear that we can't do that, and that we simply need to see Congress move forward either to raise or suspend the debt limit, and of course to have conversations about what forward spending and revenues plan should look like.
Let's end on artificial intelligence, which I think we're all fascinated by. I'm slightly freaked out by too. But I mean, ChatGPT, the explosion of it, Goldman Sachs came out and talked about the loss globally of 300 million jobs from AI. How do you think about that as you think about the labor market? Do you think it'll cost that many jobs?
So I think we're just beginning to really understand the far-reaching implications of this profound, potentially transformative technology. It could bring opportunities. It will also certainly bring risks. And so I think the president has met with members of the technology community, the private sector. We're really starting to go down the path of having a conversation where together we decide what the path forward might look like to, on the one hand, support responsible innovation, but on the other hand, make sure that that is balanced by strong safeguards.
That's very interesting. We'll end there because the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the country told me last week, essentially, just because we could doesn't mean we should. Just because we can do this with AI doesn't mean we should do all of those things right away because of what it means for jobs, et cetera. Do you agree with that?
I do think that there are some important risks here. And yes, absolutely, we need to make sure that there are important safeguards, that we all agree and put those in place so that some of those risks that are really quite sobering are addressed at the outset.
We are out of time. I really appreciate it. And I will tell you, I wholeheartedly disagree with your statement. You said in another commencement speech, central bankers are dull by design. I do not agree with that at all. This was fascinating. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.